toolkit that will. Thank you. So yeah, today is basically for us to unpack the tabled climate change bill, as well as to launch a toolkit that will assist those who are interested in submitting written comments on the bill. Just thank you so much for everyone who has joined and also has been sharing our messaging throughout the last 2 weeks on social media. So for those who will be tweeting today, our hashtag is hashtag climate change bill. And yeah, so today is basically a day for us to interact with the bill, find out how organizations and individuals can participate in getting their voices heard around the bill. We have the chat box for us to use today for any questions or any comments that people might have throughout the session. So please feel free to drop them on the during and after the presentations by the two colleagues of mine today. Yeah, so without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Brandon Abdinor, who is a climate and advocacy lawyer here at CER. Over to you, Brandon.
Thank you, Nani, and hello, everybody. It's good to see so many people here, and it's quite promising that there's this much interest in the climate change bill. If we can just ask everyone to mute themselves until... Sorry about that. Okay, so the intention of today really is to inspire you to write your own comments, make your own comments on the bill, and give you ideas about what those comments could look like and what the considerations are. We hopefully going to inspire rather than try and influence you, but we've done a lot of research around the bill, around this type of legislation around the world, and thought it might be valuable to share the kinds of things that we've learned. Obviously, from our point of view, we feel that it's essential that as many people as possible do submit comments and do become involved in the lawmaking process, on the basis that this is obviously one of the most important laws that are crossing the desks of our lawmakers for some time. It's quite interesting. The chairman of the portfolio committee indicated last week that they've already received around 3,500 comments on the bill. That's quite interesting and unusual, and we're very curious to find out where that's from. Normally the comments come in towards the deadline, which is the 27th of May. But there is a site that some of you may know about called Dear South Africa that has a semi-automated portal, and I think a lot of the comments might have come through from there. So because of that, it's even more important that we help ensure that informed comments are sent through to the portfolio committee. Everything that's going to be said during the presentation is going to be in a document that will be circulated. So you can obviously take notes if you wish, but it is all going to be made available for you to use at your leisure. I'm going to start sharing my screen. Turn off my camera for bandwidth purposes. Okay, so just to go through the program of the webinar this afternoon, I'm going to be talking about the importance of the bill, why it's critically important that we have a bill like this, and why it needs to be a robust, strong, and fit for purpose bill, and then go into the lawmaking process for this bill. Just to give you an indication of, or an idea of where the lawmaking is. And then I'm going to hand over to my colleague Tatenda, who's going to take us through some general guidelines for making submissions or written comments to give you ideas on how to go about this. She's then going to go into the first section of the toolkit, which are the actual ideas and comments. And then I will take the next section there, and then we'll have a Q&A session. Obviously, the Q&A is there to get clarity on anything that we tell you about, but we hope it's also going to be a bit of an interesting discussion platform where you can also share ideas about what you've thought about the bill if you've read it, and some of the ideas that you may have around the comments. Okay, so why is this bill so important? So in his letter to the nation in October 2021, our president said, "It is no exaggeration to say that the world is facing a climate crisis of unprecedented proportions." He's also recently gone on record acknowledging the role that climate change has played in the recent and devastating KZN floods. In her briefing to the Portfolio Committee on this bill, Minister Creasy said that climate change is an existential threat and that we must not forget that. In addition to this, South and Southern Africa have also been identified as a climate change hotspot, and there are studies that show that Southern Africa is heating at twice the global average rate, which means that we stand to face the impacts a lot more strongly. And that's why we say it's safe to say that this bill is probably such an important, if not one of the most important draft laws to cross the desks of our lawmakers. So this proposed law, which is what a bill is intended to govern our climate change response in terms of adaptation to and mitigation of climate change impacts. And it also establishes the institutional arrangements necessary to empower and delegate responsibilities to various organs of state, which all need to play their part in ensuring an effective, just transition to a climate resilient and low carbon economy and society. And those are in fact the words that are used in the bill. While the world has woken up to a lot more to the realities of the climate crisis in recent years, it's certainly gone quite mainstream. The struggle is far from over. In fact, it looks like it's really just beginning. And some of the reasons I say that is greenhouse gas emissions continue to rise. There was a smallish dip when the COVID pandemic happened, but on the whole, they're still rising. Locally and globally, greenhouse gas emission reduction targets remain too weak to keep global warming within safe limits. Successive meetings of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or the UNFCCC as it's known, as well as the annual conference of the parties, or COP meetings, continue to fail to deliver adequate agreements and actions to ensure safety. And then our own government continues to make decisions that contradict its statements and its stated commitments on the need to take urgent climate action. It continues to support and drive climate harming activities such as seeking to build new coal-fired power stations and coal mines, rolling out massive infrastructure for climate harming fossil gas to power projects, supporting risky greenhouse gas emission intensive industrial projects such as the proposed Musina Makado Special Economic Zone, or MMSEZ, up in northern Limpopo, and continuing to explore onshore and offshore fossil fuel deposits. So the talk is happening and the walk is not happening, which is one of the reasons we need this bill or this act. In terms of the lawmaking process, what we see on the screen is a relatively simplified version of what really happens. So the bill itself was drawn up by the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment, or DFFE, and it's that Minister Creasy, who tabled it in Parliament. That happened on the 18th of February this year. And then in March, the minister briefed the Parliamentary Portfolio Committee on Environment, Forestry and Fisheries. And it's this committee which will now oversee the passage of the bill through the public engagement process. And it has now called for written comments or submissions. So we use comments and submissions interchangeably on the bill, and these are due on the 27th of this month. So just for background information, the Portfolio Committee is made up of a number of members of Parliament that actually sit and work in a focused way on, in this case, environmental issues. The committee has some discretion on whether it's going to call for public hearings. And because of this, we feel it's quite important that people call in the committee in their comments to actually hold these hearings. And we'll cover that in a bit more detail just now. So that they certainly get a strong message that we want to be heard, and we want to be heard locally all around the country. Once this phase of the process is complete, The bill then goes to the National Council of Provinces because it's one of those pieces of legislation that impacts both on a national and a provincial level. So it goes into the second level of legislative process. And it's considered by each province's select committee on land reform, environment, mineral resources, and energy. Each of these committees will receive a briefing on the bill, just the same way that the National Committee did, so that its members can tell their respective provincial legislatures about its content. The bill will then be considered by each of the 9 provincial legislatures. There may be further public participation opportunities at this stage, and that's certainly something that can be pushed and called for as well. And once that has happened, the bill goes back to the National Council of Provinces. If the National Council passes the bill, it will go to the President for assent and signature. If the National Council of Provinces rejects or amends the bill, it then goes back to the National Assembly for reconsideration. If the National Assembly accepts the amended bill, it will go to the President for his assent. If the National Assembly rejects the National Council of Province amendment, the bill then goes to a mediation committee comprising of members from the National Assembly and members from the NCOP. And if that mediation committee is unable to agree or reach a solution within 30 days of the bill's referral, the bill lapses. So that's going into a bit more detail than we necessarily need here, but just to give you a context and to point out that the pathway to having a final Climate Change Act is still a relatively long one and potentially quite complicated. And then once the president signs it and assents to it, it becomes the Climate Change Act. And then this is the piece of legislation that has such an influential role in how our climate response is governed. I'm just going to go into a brief explainer of our nationally determined contributions, and you'll see a little bit later why this is important. So the nationally determined contribution, or NDC as it's usually known, is a mechanism that came into being via the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement is a global agreement on climate change response, and each country that is a party to the Paris Agreement is responsible for adopting and submitting an NDC. An NDC includes a target adopted by nations, which is required to reflect their highest possible ambitions, and that's the wording in the Paris Agreement, and commitments in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Along with most of the other 196 signatory nations, South Africa submitted its first NDC in 2015. This NDC that we submitted back then had greenhouse gas emission reductions targets, which, if all states were to adopt similar targets, would put the world on track for a global 4-degree temperature increase. Just for those who are not aware, currently we're sitting at around 1.1 degrees, and that's above pre-industrial levels, and that's measured back to 1850. So effectively, when we started extracting and burning fossil fuels in earnest, back in the middle of that century, is really when the carbon dioxide levels started going up and when the temperature started rising. So we're already at 1.1 and seeing some very uncomfortable and downright dangerous impacts. So you can imagine what a 4-degree temperature increase would look like. In 2021, we updated our NDC, and it now incorporates targets which bring the trajectory down to a 2-degree temperature increase, which is still well above the 1.5-degree increase that science tells us is far less dangerous. So this has become more and more sort of publicized, and the science is more overt in expressing it, that we really need to try and stick to a 1.5-degree warming level. It's not that everything suddenly changes above that level, but that has been found to be the threshold after which the risks start intensifying to really dangerous levels. So while our update from 2021 is obviously an improvement on the 2015 NDC, it's still not ambitious enough to ensure a safe and livable climate for all. Okay, I'm now going to hand over to Tatenda, who's going to start off with giving us, first of all, some general tips and ideas around writing submissions, and then start going into some of the toolkit comments themselves.
Thanks, Brendan. Hi, everyone. So as Brendan said, I'm going to be taking you through the general guideline on how you submit comments, what needs to be in your comments, and where you submit them to. So I'm just going to be sharing my screen now. Brendan, can you please share for me the slide? Thank you. So as we all know, the South African Constitution makes provision for public involvement in lawmaking, oversight, and other processes of parliament. South Africa's democratic system not only provides for citizens to elect their representatives, but it also allows citizens to have a say in matters that affect them, in this instance, in the climate bill. One of the ways that the public can make their voices heard is by making submissions to the National Assembly committees, the National Council of Provinces committees or joint committees. For submissions from the public to be effective, the content, format need to be considered carefully when you're making comments. So that is, the person who's making the comments needs to make sure that they've carefully considered what they want to comment on. And it's also very important that a submission is easily read and understood by the members of committees. Any objections and recommendations should be clearly stated upfront. Next slide, please. So firstly, what is a submission? It's basically a presentation of your views or opinions on a matter or piece of legislation under consideration by a committee of parliament. So these submissions may be presented in your own language and tone of choice, and it doesn't need to be technical in nature. Submissions are usually written in written form. They can be reinforced through oral representation to the committees. If the person or group who has made the submission is invited to make an oral presentation. Making submissions creates an opportunity for any member of the public to propose changes or suggest possible actions to ensure that the laws passed by Parliament or any other matter being considered by Parliament serve their purpose and are in the public interest. Next slide, please, Brenda. So now on how to write a submission. There is no set format for a submission to a committee, but however, it should be well thought out and easy to read. So I'm just going to give you some suggestions on how you can actually achieve this. So firstly, you need a heading. So you need to head your submission with the name of the committee to which it is addressed and the full title of the bill or topic. And who is it from? Clearly state whom the submission is from. If you're an individual, state your name. If you're an organization, state the name of the organization that you're representing, and also provide your contact details, include a contact address and daytime telephone number. If for private reasons you do not wish those details to be publicly released with your submission, you need to state this in your covering letter and leave it off the submission itself. And another thing is you also need to state whether or not you wish to appear before the committee. Clearly indicate whether you would like the opportunity to address the committee in person. If you represent an organization and you wish others to appear with you before the committee, either for support or to speak, include their names and their roles as well. You also need to include details of your organization, especially if you're writing on behalf of an organization. Give brief details of the organization's aims, membership, and structure. Make sure that you have the authority to do so and not your position within the organization. You also need to state who else supports you. You may note how widely you've consulted during the writing of the submission. Your submission may have more standing if it is a wide support base. So basically, when you're making the submissions, make sure that you are able to tell your story, share your concerns, objections, and questions, and link them to the bill or the issue in question in the bill. Tell your personal story and describe your circumstances and how the climate change and the bill will impact you. Be appropriately respectful in your tone because this is a formal document, but at the same time, you need to feel free to express any strong concerns or objections that you may have. Be relevant, keeping your comments relevant to the bill. Although you can express general concerns about climate change, to explain your specific concerns or objections about the bill, you still need to be very relevant to the bill. And remember, your comments and inputs may not result in changes in the bill, but they will be heard or read and considered by the portfolio committee. And in this way, committee members will be conscientized about the concerns of the people on climate change and South Africa's response.
Hi, everyone. We're just checking. I see there's a lot of comments around the loss of audio. I'm not sure if we've just lost our speaker, if we can hear each other.
We hear you loud and clear, Mish. I think it's just the speaker.
Okay. Great.
All right, let me carry on for now. I'm not quite sure what happened to Tatenda. Hopefully she'll find her way back on. So obviously these are the key pieces of information in terms of contact. So the portfolio committee secretary is Tieleka Madubela, and the comments on the bill need to be sent in on the 27th of May to that email address over there. Again, this will all be in the document that's circulated. And then you can also contact Tieleka to direct any queries to her, and those are her contact details over there. And obviously, officially, the comments were issued by the chairperson of the portfolio committee. So that is Ms. Faith Mutambi, who's obviously also a member of parliament. Okay, so going into some of the toolkit itself. So really the intention here is that this is a guideline to offer ideas and information for you to use when you create your submission. And as I mentioned earlier, it is based on a lot of the research we've done. So what we're going to present today is not necessarily going to be the sum total. It's not going to be the sum total of our comments, for example. But some of the comments that we're going to make are going to be quite technical in nature. And we will probably also make comments on some quite aspirational ideas that we would like to table based on some of the best practice around the world. But we are basically going to be covering the key issues. And in the Q&A, perhaps we'll have some time and space to talk about some additional ideas that we haven't covered over here. So ensure that what you use from this toolkit aligns with your own views and is true for you and your situation. So it's not a situation of putting words in your mouth. Take from it what feels relevant to you, because you may be required to back up what you say. You might be invited to do an oral presentation, and you don't want to be in a situation where you are expected to explain objections that aren't in alignment with you. So try and use your own words as much as possible as well. That's why we put a lot of the points that we're offering for use or for you to consider as bullet points, so that you can weave them into your own story or your own objection, if you like. And then a disclaimer, so the information that we are provided and any statements we are making in this webinar and in the document do not constitute legal advice. As soon as it becomes legal advice, which is in a formal sort of attorney-client situation, then a whole set of rules kick in, and it's a different situation. So the first comment that we, or issue that we are putting on the table for you to consider is not around the content of the bill, but it's more around the lawmaking process. So the one that I outlined a little bit earlier. And that is this issue of public participation. Because the bill will affect everybody, it's important to have as many diverse views and voices being heard as possible. I caught a glimpse of a comment by Traverse, I think, saying that, you know, many of the comments that have come through the Dear South Africa site are sort of very gripey about the government. Some of them is even sort of reflect climate change denial. So, you know, you are going to get that kind of noise happening. But it's quite possible that the people who have different views around climate response are also going to be submitting comments. So it's not inconceivable that people from high emissions industries do, et cetera, or other people with vested interests perhaps in the current high carbon economy. So from that point of view, you know, we want to encourage as many people as possible to submit comments and to call for these public participation meetings. So not only do we suggest that you call for meetings, but we also suggest that people consider asking the committee to make sure these meetings are meaningful. We unfortunately have a culture and a history in the country where public participation is treated as a box-ticking exercise, and officials sometimes conduct them just for the sake of it. So they should be urged to have these in the spirit of properly hearing and listening to different voices. We also, or you can also consider that asking the committee to ensure that hearings are held in your city or your town or your area. And in particular, there are areas that are more vulnerable to climate change or more kind of have a need for this just transition to happen. So if we think of areas like Lephalale or Emalahlenyi, where obviously there's extensive coal mining and where the climate response, including emissions reduction, is going to have an impact. It's quite important that areas like that in particular get heard, but really there's no place or area or city or town that is not going to be impacted. So asking the committee to have extensive hearings around the country is something that could have a lot of value. Given that youth and women are most exposed to the impacts of climate change, it is important that their voices are heard and that they have an adequate opportunity to participate in these processes. Knowledgeable interpreters should be on attendance so that people can express themselves in any language of their choice. Again, we've seen situations where there are no interpreters at all, which obviously really causes communication issues. Or sometimes there are, but they do not understand the issues. So having interpreters or translators that really understand the issues is critically important, and that can be asked for as well. We can ask for accessible and understandable language and terminology. I'm sure many of the colleagues in the room will have been in public participation meetings where we have some form of expert who rattles off a lot of technical jargon, maybe shows some very technical graphs on a very small PowerPoint slide or whatever the case is. And really, again, is trying to get through the material to be able to tick the box. That is not meaningful public participation. So we want the committee to really get its head around what it means to consult and consult meaningfully. There needs to be clear, easy to find an early notice of meetings. Time and time again, we see situations where notice of a meeting happens the day before or 2 days before. Perhaps it's in some small ad in the newspapers. Whereas really going into this with the intention of actually notifying people and ensuring that there's as much attendance as possible, is a different mindset. And again, bringing this to the attention of the portfolio committee is quite important. Interestingly, this portfolio committee, most of the members on it are relatively new to this portfolio. We got to do a presentation to them in December last year, and a lot of them don't seem to have really understood these issues in depth before. At the briefing, one of the portfolio committee members asked Minister Creasy to ensure that there is good public participation, and she rightly turned around and said, it's you, the committee, that actually needs to set the tone of this. So by making these comments and sending them through, you are in a sense educating these portfolio committee members as to what their responsibilities are as well, which is a big part of the value of sending a submission through. It's quite reasonable to ask for assistance with resources such as data and transport. There's in fact a parliamentary public education office which has the mandate of trying to ensure that there's as much public participation as possible, and they in fact make transport available for up to 100 persons per meeting within a 100-kilometer radius. So we're working with them and are going to try and maximize the input there. But again, from the point of view of making a submission, ask, state what the needs are, and again, make the portfolio committee members aware of their responsibilities. It's quite important that there are knowledgeable facilitators who can actually answer questions. In a process like this, I would imagine that there would be, but again, we've seen processes where that's not the case, and then half the questions at a public hearing like that don't get answered. There are promises that they will be answered in future, and the future often never comes. So one wants to be able to have those questions asked and answered, ideally in the hearings while everybody's there and everyone can hear the answers. And then it's important that questions as well as the answers to the questions are recorded and made publicly available, so that one can actually take a look at what's really happening, get a sense of what the views really are. Often those who may want to push through some legislation will make claims about how their particular view is widely supported, which is often not necessarily the case. I just want to check if Tatenda is back.
Yes, I'm back now.
Back, okay, great. I'll hand back to you then, basically kicking off with access to information and transparency.
All right, thank you. Sorry about that. So when it comes to access to information and transparency, you all know that people need access to information to understand what progress is being made in relation to the bill and also to make choices. So because of the climate crisis, because the fact that the climate crisis impacts on everyone, the community, business, and social activity people actually do need this information in order to understand how the country's climate response is progressing and how the different role players are responding in terms of exercising their mandates and responsibility. So in terms of the bill says that any information that is provided to the government must be made available to the public, subject to the Promotion of Access to Information Act and the Protection of Personal Information Act. Our concern with regards to this provision is that it is weak in that both PIA and POPIA have grounds on which the providing of information can be refused, for example, on commercial grounds. These grounds have been known to be abused by entities not wishing to disclose certain information needed for the protection of rights. Furthermore, the processes required by PIA and POPIA are time-consuming and can be costly and overly burdensome, not conducive to easily and quickly obtaining real-time information on issues of South Africa's climate response progress in relation to greenhouse gas emission reductions. The information which should be readily accessible by default. The wording of the clause also suggests that information generated by the Minister or Department of the Environment does not need to be made publicly available, and that is very concerning. So when you're now submitting your comments, things to think about are requesting or demanding that information is provided in an easy to understand format it's comprehensive, and that it's easily available to members of the public without having to request it or overcome complicated hurdles or procedures that you may incur if you actually use PIA or POPIA. In particular, we need access to information on the performance of emitters regarding greenhouse gas emission reduction responsibilities, what carbon budgets are assigned to them, if there are any exemptions, and if they're complying. We would also need access to information on adaptation and climate response plans from different sectors and ministries, for example, energy, agriculture, transport, or water, as well as from municipalities and provinces. Climate adaptation is necessary to keep us all safe and will often involve changes to the way we live and work. We need to know what is planned so that we can respond adequately. And we also need to be able to make informed input into these plans. So without information, we cannot participate in the protection of our rights and our lives and livelihoods. Some climate change laws around the world, for example, in Fiji and Guatemala, provide for a web-based information platform that anyone can access in order to see these and other key pieces of information relating to the country's climate response. So this could be one of the things you can advocate for in your comments. Another issue here is that we need to request or demand that the timeframes and the deadlines that are set in the bill reflects urgency of the climate crisis and the need to respond effectively. So the problem here is that the science tells us that this is a decade where decisive action in terms of greenhouse gas emissions reduction needs to be taken in order to prevent or minimize climate risk and harmful impacts. We therefore need to reduce these greenhouse emissions by 45% by 2030 to stay within the 1.5 degrees safe level of global warming. The United Nations IPCC has released most of its sixth assessment report, which presents the latest and widely accepted science around climate change adaptation, mitigation, and the fiscal impacts of climate change. The bill must enable and actually compel this action. We're also seeing that the impacts of climate change are intensifying and they're causing a lot of damage. For example, the recent floods in KZN and the droughts that have recently been experienced in parts of South Africa. We therefore need to see adaptation measures that are being implemented urgently and as a top priority. So in terms of the bill, there are no timeframes or deadlines for important provisions such as assigning carbon budgets to emitters, that is how much companies and entities are allowed to emit in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, or sectorial emissions targets, that is how much each sector, such as energy, agriculture, and transport, is allowed to emit. So there are no timeframes compelling the minister to set an emissions trajectory as well. That is the pathway that plots and manages greenhouse gas emissions reduction over time. On the adaptation side, many of the important climate change response plans are not required to have to be completed for a number of years in terms of the bill. In the case of different ministries, the deadline for adaptation plans is 3 years after the Climate Change Act comes into being. And in the case of municipalities and provinces, this deadline is a full 5 years away. And this is problematic because it doesn't reflect a sense of urgency, considering where we are with the climate crisis at the moment. So some issues to think about when you make your submissions in relation to this point is for you to urge the government to include deadlines on the determination of an emissions reduction trajectory, the assignment of carbon budgets, and the completion of sectorial emission targets. Also to express concern that the long lead times on adaptation and climate response plans leaves people, communities, and businesses at risk from climate change impacts. While some of this planning is complicated and will take time, climate adaptation should be on the top of the agenda for organs of state already. I'll hand over to you, Brendan.
Thank you, Tatenda. Okay, so that's around urgency and transparency. So two of the key features that are really not evident if one looks at the bill. And that's obviously completely at odds with how the climate crisis is marching on. The next issue that is problematic in quite a fundamental way is the targets that are included. And we feel strongly that the bill must contain the safest and most cautious targets according to the latest and best available science. South Africa, just like all other nations, needs solid and suitably ambitious targets in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions sufficiently to avoid dangerous global warming levels. As mentioned earlier, South Africa is warming at twice the global average rate. So in other words, a 2-degree temperature increase globally equates to a very dangerous 4-degree temperature increase in South Africa. And that's come out in the IPCC reports, particularly report 1 on the physical science basis. Southern Africa is one of the relatively few regions that is set to become drier, and everywhere is getting hotter, but Southern Africa will be getting drier. And that already in a water scarce country. So obviously this is a cause for huge concern. South Africa and its government have a constitutional imperative to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and limit temperature increases and the associated climate impacts. So we've obviously got the constitutional right to an environment that's safe to everyone's well-being, both for current and future generations. But there are in fact about 4 or 5 different rights in our Bill of Rights that can directly be linked to the harms that come out of climate change. So the argument is to be made that if this bill and the government in general do not take sufficient action, that those rights have been compromised. So, and this is really very disturbing. What the bill currently says, it says that the minister must set a greenhouse gas emissions trajectory, in other words, a pathway. It doesn't say reduction trajectory, interestingly, but one assumes that's what's envisaged. A pathway by which emissions will be reduced in a progressive manner over particular periods of time. But the bill does not provide a time frame or a deadline within which the minister needs to do this. So we obviously currently have a minister that does seem to understand climate change and the issues. And the fact that this bill has seen the light of day after going underground for some years is an indication that there is some seriousness around this. And one trusts that the current minister would go ahead with establishing this emissions trajectory even without a deadline in the bill. But we can't necessarily count on that. And what happens if there's a change of guard and we get someone in that position that is not as committed to ensuring the climate response, and then we have an act that leaves this particular and very important aspect hanging, potentially indefinitely. So that emissions trajectory is something that's still to come. And the bill then says that until such time as an emissions trajectory is established, we will use the NDC that is attached to the bill as Schedule 1. Now, the problem is that the NDC that's attached to Schedule 1 is not our updated NDC of 2021, but it's the NDC from 2015. So that's the one that puts us on a 4-degree temperature increase. So this is possibly the single most unacceptable element in this bill. You know, it's potentially completely contravenes our commitments in terms of the Paris Agreement. How can we be sending one set of targets to the UN, and then in our kind of main climate change legislation, we say we're going to follow a completely different and totally inadequate one? The bill is also silent on any net zero targets. So there's been a trend in the last few years of nations and companies as well, for that matter, setting targets known as net zero by 2050. And this comes from an IPCC report on 1.5 degree temperature increase that came out a few years ago. And it said, in order to stick to the 1.5 degree limit, one of the things we need to do is reduce our emissions by 45% by 2030. And the second thing that we need to do is ensure that there's net zero by 2050. So this has become quite a popular target that gets bandied about. There's a few countries who've said net zero by 2060, but generally most of them follow that IPCC report. And there's just a note here on this concept of net zero. So net zero really means that the amount we emit can then be set off against the amount of carbon dioxide that we draw down from the atmosphere or resequestrate. And the theory here is that we can emit on the one hand and pull it back on the other hand, and the net effect must be zero. But this concept is very much open to abuse in that the technology to do that carbon dioxide removal does not exist at anywhere near the scale that it's meaningful. There are a few pilot projects in the world that really draw negligible amounts of, relatively speaking, of carbon from the atmosphere. And that's not to say it might not end up getting there at some point, but we need to ask ourselves whether it will be affordable, whether it's really feasible, and what the other potential environmental and social impacts of something like that are. So this concept does get badly abused, and people are making these commitments, counting on some, at this point, mythical technology which is going to sort it out in future. So we need to see a net zero target in there by 2050, ideally, along with incremental or interim targets. So there's not that much value in just saying we will get to net zero by 2050 and leave everything for the next 30 years and then suddenly wake up in the last year. So we want to see interim targets that are strong. So in terms of what you could think about for any submission, strongly say that this 2015 NDC as an interim trajectory is not acceptable. Sorry, I just want to mute somebody. Because it puts us on this very dangerous pathway. It's also, you know, we're sitting in an environment now where the concept of climate finance is becoming a reality. And we're busy dissecting one of the first major deals of its kind in South Africa. And one of the reasons we got it is because for a range of different reasons, we are seen as an attractive destination for that kind of investment. Now, if we send out a signal that our Climate Change Act has got an old NDC of that nature, what does that do to our credibility? There's a risk at some point in the future, perhaps not that far away, that certain states starts being seen as pariah states. Obviously, we're by far not the worst in the world, but we are the 12th worst. So this is something to consider as well, over and above the pure safety level. The targets need to be progressively more ambitious. And there needs to be what's sometimes known as a ratcheting mechanism, that they don't go backwards. So every set of targets needs to be more ambitious, stronger, basically account for more emissions reductions. And then something that is adopted in a number of climate change acts around the world is the establishment or the appointment of an independent scientific body to advise. So this is where people who really understand the climate science, as well as other physical sciences around the impacts of climate change, basically are the kind of collectors of scientific information, which then gets used to advise things like the setting of targets. And the idea is there that there's a credible and relatively impartial voice that really looks at the best available science, which then informs government in terms of the kind of decisions that get made. So the bill does refer to a number of places where they talk about the best available science. So it's better that it's there than not, but that's not as strong as having an independent scientific body like this. Some people have argued that perhaps the Presidential Climate Commission could be that, but that is not what the Commission is or its function. The Commission is obviously a multi-stakeholder forum where the social compacts around climate change and the kind of choices that need to be made actually get thrashed out, and hopefully the consensus is found. So calling for proper independent science is potentially very constructive. And then another aspect of quite great concern is this issue of penalties, compliance, and enforcement. So this needs to be strong, and it needs to provide an effective deterrent against excessive greenhouse gas emissions, as well as other activities which are harmful to an effective climate response. So the key characteristic of the climate struggle, or the reality, is that obviously many emitters and many of the role players in government who enable that are reluctant or unwilling to undertake the very central and vital action of steadily and urgently reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And if there are inadequate measures to compel this reduction, then the bill runs the risk of being ineffective or toothless, and insufficient change will happen where it's really most needed. So what the bill says in terms of this, firstly, the only offence in the bill is the failure to provide a greenhouse gas mitigation plan. So certain activities are going to be identified as priority activities, and certain emissions thresholds, and all companies and entities that emit over a certain level or fall within a certain sector or activity are going to have to provide a greenhouse gas mitigation plan that basically spells out what their plan is to reduce their own emissions. And that's in the bill, and that's great. And the failure to provide one is an offence. But other than that, there are no offences whatsoever. So in earlier versions of the bill, sorry, let me go back a step. What the bill does provide for, it says that persons, this is the word that's used, but generally this will be companies again, will be assigned carbon budgets. Now, again, there are no timeframes for this assignment of carbon budgets, going back to this issue of urgency. But these entities will be assigned carbon budgets, and that's really a budget that limits how many greenhouse gases you can emit. Now, earlier versions of the bill said that persons or companies exceeding their carbon budgets would be subject to a higher carbon tax rate for those excessive emissions. But this has actually been removed in this current form of the bill. So in the current form of the bill, there is really no penalty whatsoever within this bill itself in terms of exceeding your carbon budget. Now, we know from the budget speech this year, as well as other statements and documents from National Treasury, as well as the statements and documents from the Environment Ministry, that the intention here is that a higher carbon tax rate will be levied. That will go through the Carbon Tax Act, which is administered by National Treasury. And the idea there is that if you emit more than you're allowed to, you will pay a much higher carbon tax rate. And that is supposed to be the disincentive or the incentive to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions. Unfortunately, that the system is not very publicly available for scrutiny, and it's potentially a little bit fragmented. There are questions around where do the regulations sit? Do they sit here? Do they sit with Treasury, etc.? So we don't really know what that's going to look like. The current carbon tax is extremely low. There's a range of sort of discounts and allowances. We are told that this is really going to kick in properly in 2026. That's great. If that happens, then we're going to have one angle from which there will be a disincentive. But again, we're relying really on the word of some of the politicians and hopefully the goodwill that we think they have. So we feel it's quite important that they also the exceeding of the carbon budget needs to be made an offence, because then in addition to this additional carbon tax that excessive emitters will need to pay, one can actually issue things like prohibition notices and actually stop them from doing that. Because we could get a situation where one hopes this carbon tax rate would be, very kind of onerous, but one could get a situation where a big emitter decides it's worth their while to exceed the carbon budget, attract the additional tax liability, and carry on doing what they're doing. And then the way things stand at the moment, there's nothing else that could be done. So effectively, that polluter could just choose to pay for their pollution and carry on. So we feel there need to be additional teeth here that say it is an offense, and the regulator will have the power to actually compel emitters to stop. We also feel, as is in some of the climate acts around the world, that providing false, misleading, or incomplete information in terms of the provisions of this bill should also be an offense. We know from history that when it comes to managing air pollution, for example, there certainly is a lot of ducking and diving that goes on, and we want to be able to compel people to provide accurate information. And then one of the potentially really trickiest parts of this bill is how it seeks to rope all of the organs of state in and create an all-of-government approach to combating climate change and to responding to it appropriately, because that's what's going to be required, especially from an adaptation point of view. Obviously, municipalities and provinces need to, are going to be very much in the front line of that, so they need to be involved. We need to have different ministries involved. Obviously, the energy ministry is a big one. I mean, that really remains the low-hanging fruit in terms of emissions reduction. Transport, agriculture, etc., also need to play their role. So this level of collaboration between these organs of state is potentially unprecedented, and we need to at least raise these concerns. It's really difficult to say what the exact mechanism should look like. So the bill does cover this. It does prescribe responsibilities to different ministries. There's a whole chapter on the responsibilities of municipalities and provinces, but the feeling is that this could be strengthened a lot to create the desired result. So one of the things we're suggesting that could be thought about is to strengthen the clauses that ensure all decision makers comply with sectoral emissions targets and carbon budgets. So a good example here is we have ministries that provide authorizations. But are they doing that with keeping an eye on how many emissions can be emitted within their particular sector? So that strengthening this obligation on decision makers to comply with the provisions of this bill is important. Then there's a thought that ministries should create a focal point or a dedicated office within the different ministries which is responsible for climate response to ensure accountability and adequate performance. We are nervous that there might be a situation that different ministries who are not directly involved in climate change at this point in time might, again, tick the boxes, say that they are taking it into account, but not meaningfully doing so. And having a focal point or an office within each ministry is one way of trying to ensure more accountability. The Department of the Forestries, Fisheries and Environment must also be adequately empowered to coordinate. So we don't want to have a situation where, the environment ministry is kind of competing with other ones and they're sort of playing on a level playing field, and, they're responsible for climate change, the others are responsible for their sectors, and there's no kind of cohesive response and approach. So that Ministry of the Environment must be able to issue guidelines and monitor and evaluate the climate response measures and actions of other state entities. Interestingly, what came out of the latest IPCC report, the Working Group 3 on mitigation, They actually said it's not even that appropriate for climate response to sit within the environment ministry, because environmental ministries are often not that well funded and don't have that much political power. And the suggestion is there that perhaps a special ministry of climate change response needs to be set up. I think it's possibly beyond the scope of this bill, obviously, but those are the kinds of thoughts you can put in your comments, and certainly something that we should be having conversations about. There should be a mandate and an obligation to report regularly and comprehensively to Parliament on progress made with this bill. Again, that sits in some of the climate change acts around the world, and it just ensures that climate change is on the agenda in a sufficiently prioritized way. So that is something that could be there. Then obviously all of this climate response needs money, and National Treasury holds a lot of the keys. So one would like to see National Treasury also specifically reporting on climate change related financial matters, what the different measures cost, what sort of finance and financial aid is coming in, and what the impacts of climate change costs. The costs of climate impacts are. Really, if we start to tally those things together, perhaps also starts to create a reality check on the seriousness of the situation. There needs to be very strong empowerment of local and provincial government. If you think that local government sits with much of the adaptation responsibility, the chances are that the knowledge and understanding and technical support and financial support for that matter are probably not there. I was in a meeting the other day and someone said that the induction for new councillors made no mention of climate change. And perhaps that should be one of the first and biggest things that is mentioned, so that they understand what it is that they are needing to manage. And then provincial and local governments need to do climate sort of risk mapping and assessments and risk and vulnerability surveys and that sort of thing, and then need to come up with plans in response to that. So the suggestion here is that it's not just good enough to come up with some plan that perhaps doesn't have that much value, but that these things should actually be technically evaluated by the Department of Environment to see that they're sound. And that sort of detail is not in the bill. And again, to raise that sort of awareness in your comments might open the eyes of the portfolio committee members and sort of just stimulate some of the right kind of thinking. And then, and this actually, I put the slide in not long before we started, and that was based on this discovery of the kind of comments that are coming in on the Dear South Africa site, where they are telling everyone that climate change is nonsense and we don't need an act like this, is although you want to express your concerns about the bill, it's also worth expressing support for the fact that there is a bill and that we are going to have a legal basis on which to build our climate response and our kind of pathway to a low carbon and climate resilient economy and society. So, you know, even from our point of view, as much as there is some grave concern around some of the things in the bill and some of the things missing in the bill, the fact that we do now have a Climate Change Act potentially within our sights in the next while, perhaps well, the end of the year would be quite hopeful, I'd imagine, but who knows, probably sometime next year, is at least going to ensure that the things that have been happening voluntarily and the things that have not been happening at all can start to happen and be compelled to happen. And then we can start taking actions to protect rights and ensure that the climate response is what we need it to be. Okay, so that's the toolkit. As I say, there are more issues that we will certainly be raising, and I'm aware of others who will be raising certain aspects. Just one off the top of my head is perhaps thinking about a clause that says that any climate finance needs to be transparent, for example. I mean, we are sitting with this potential windfall of $8.5 billion of climate finance, but is it really? Or is it something that's going to just increase our sovereign debt with terms and conditions that do not leave us in a better position, perhaps even in a worse one? So those are the kind of additional things that we can think of putting in there, and again, alerting the portfolio committee to some of the risks and some of the things that need to be considered. Okay, so with that, we can go into the Q&A session. I must say I haven't been following the chat myself, but we can start doing that. But we can also take hands, and if you've got any questions on what you've heard, or there are pieces that we didn't cover that you think might be interesting for everyone else in the meeting to hear, by all means put up your hand. Let's see what we can answer, and let's see what we can learn together about making a good climate change act. Start looking at the chat in the meantime. Just to answer one question, yes, there will be a copy of the recording and the presentation will both be made available. Okay, Ron, your hand is up.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. Okay, so thank you for hosting this. It's been very informative. So the economists estimate it would cost between $1 to $2 trillion per year to reach the Paris Agreement's compliance levels. If every country manages the impossible task of lowering their emissions to these compliance levels, then in 100 years' time, we will have lowered the global temperature by 0.017 degrees centigrade. That's according to the former director of the Copenhagen Consensus Center, the Danish government's Environmental Assessment Institute in Copenhagen. Would money not be better spent on education and healthcare, education that leads to innovations to create true sustainable living, and obviously not propaganda that leaves everyone disenfranchised, ignorant, and incapable of providing solutions? If everyone knows the larger the governing body becomes, the more bureaucracy and more inefficient the spending becomes, which leads to my next question. This relates to top-down control and accountability. These regulations come from first world and developed countries. I see that you put lots of pictures there about the flooding and whatnot, and obviously it's difficult to tie those floods to climate change, as we've had floods like that in 84, 87, I think 2017, and now. But I can give an example of how these regulations have negatively affected South Africans during our floods. Our building regulations, for example, have been stipulated by Brussels. To get official building approval, houses from Durban beachfront to the KZN Midlands need to be fitted with double glazed windows to improve efficiency and lower carbon dioxide emissions. Now, everyone who lives here understands the absurdity of placing these dramatically different temperature ranges in the same category and completely unnecessary exorbitant costs that those regulations would impose. So instead of getting planning permission, people build their houses without proper guidance, and their homes collapse or wash down hills during rains. Who is accountable for this, and who suffers because of the lack of the understanding of some bureaucrats in Europe somewhere? My next question is, why should Africans put all their trust and money into institutions that are mostly providing inept solutions that are not actual solutions, but hobbling the economy in the process? We have things like TB, malaria, sanitation issues, and all these things obviously need to be dealt with. On top of that, we are some of the lowest carbon dioxide emitters on the planet. What is stopping corrupt mega corporations, demonstrably the biggest polluters, from continuing their polluting and lobbying politicians to look the other way, and then landing us with the price tag? This, to me, feels like imperialism under a different name.
Sorry,
can you
Bron.
guarantee?
Sorry,
yes.
Bron. I'm gonna cut.
Yes.
I'm gonna cut you short. It doesn't sound like you are asking legitimate questions in the
No,
context
sorry, I'm
of the
very close to
framework
my end, and I
of this
will
climate
wrap
change
up
bill.
very neatly with my two questions.
So please,
No, I do. Sorry, I do have
I'm
questions.
not one of the
and I've just got
organizers,
one more
but I'm a
paragraph, and
participant,
then I'll ask the
and
two
I
questions.
don't think this is right, and I don't think it's I don't think it's respectful to everybody else who's on the call. So if you want to post that stuff, you can post it in the chat. And I would.
Sorry, I have
encourage
two
the
legitimate
organizer
questions right at
to
the
cut you
bottom
short.
here, and I'm just gearing up so that we can understand why I'm asking these questions and the background to them. You know, I am concerned about the middle class and small family-owned businesses getting wiped out because they don't have enough environmental credit score because they can't afford to bribe the government or something, like SEG scores in the US that don't correlate with environment impact at all. And it's to do with
implore you to
cronyism.
self-censor yourself, please. Honestly, this is not the right forum for that. Please.
Sorry, I thought we were asking questions about this.
Okay,
this
Brian, can you
act.
get to the point of the
Yes, my two questions are,
Yeah.
would our money not be better spent looking after the poor so in turn they can solve future problems through, I mean, let's say putting the money towards initiatives? And then the next one, what checks and balances are in place to stop large corporations from hobbling the African economy yet again, leading to the same cycle of debt and resource trading that got Africa into the poverty cycle to begin with? That's it. Thank you very much for hearing me out.
Thank you. Okay, yeah, there's quite a lot of sort of general statements in there. So the purpose of an act like this is exactly to stop, you spoke about corrupt mega corporations. Obviously, we're talking about a whole matrix, or you're talking about a whole matrix of issues, corruption and economics and things like that, which are don't fall squarely within climate response, although these things are interlinked. But the point is that having an act like this that actually ensures that the corporations, because they're the emitters, reduce the emissions effectively is the whole point, so that we don't land ourselves in a situation where there's increasing harm. Sure, we need to spend money on health and education, but there are not going to be schools and hospitals if the climate crisis bites the way we think it's going to be biting. So is this expensive? Yes, it is expensive. It's not nearly as expensive as not taking proper action. Energy efficiency is critically important. We can't spend the energy budget that we have been forever, even with renewable energy, as important as that is. So we do need to learn to live more leanly. Does that translate down the line into double glazing regulations? Sometimes it does. But really the intentions are appropriate and we need to do that. Any other questions?
Okay, thank you.
I'll start looking. Dina.
Hi, thank you so much for this workshop. I kind of have a strategic question because I think what you've been laying out incredibly clearly and usefully is how to make kind of full and substantiated, well-grounded comments. But of course, what we're seeing on Dear South Africa is a lot of sort of shoot from the hip, slightly hysterical comments. I wonder if, strategically speaking, it wouldn't be good to also submit comments there. Maybe not the full thought out kind of comments that would need to go in a letter, but just to sort of counter because they're remarkable in their capacity just to get numbers right of a certain part of the population. I wonder if there's any value in encouraging comments from the other side on that forum.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know how those comments end up coming through to the portfolio committee, if it's evident that they've come through this portal and therefore perhaps get treated with a little bit less seriousness. I don't know. So that's certainly something that could happen, and one could go into Dear South Africa and just put really a few very fundamental things, almost the headings of the stuff we've been talking about. Welcoming the climate bill, expressing concern at the climate crisis and the damage that's already here and that's still to come, and raising issues around transparency, good targets, etc. But even that, I think, would take a lot of energy to counter the 4,000 quite nonsensical things that are there at this point in time. So yeah, everyone's got the capacity. Otherwise, just send yours in and make it, make them as distinguishable and make them stand out as much as possible. One trusts that everyone who reads these things is going to be applying themselves to it, and that some of those shoot from the hip one-liners will get disregarded. but yeah, that is something that needs to be done. Courtney's saying that even for the optics point of view, that might be worth doing. Traverse, I'll come to you now. I just want to answer Mbali's question. So she says, do you envisage for a climate change command council, what would the role be, and would it be a national, provincial, or local body? So the thought is just if there is some sort of centralized monitoring of climate response, and particularly empowerment. I mean, think of your average municipality, perhaps that's half bankrupt already and is already battling with water issues, etc. Being able to get technical advice and kind of knowledge share around their climate change response and their adaptation needs. So it's more of a conceptual idea than necessarily a proposal for a specific office. But if there's a sense that we're all in it together, but those who really understand and have the knowledge and can make things happen are there to assist and support and facilitate other state entities that perhaps don't have the wherewithal to do that. Traverse?
Thank you, Brandon. My concern is just with regards to the present draft of the text in the bill and the incredible powers it gives the Environment Minister. Not that that's a bad thing. If we've got a good Environment Minister, we can get good outcomes. But my real concern is simply, you know, in 2024, a good example, we face the prospect of a very real likelihood that the ANC might not remain in power. And that will mean a change in the executive. And all the power that presently is vested in this bill is reliant on good individuals being in key positions. So my worry with this is, where are we building in redundancy into the present bill to ensure that there's continuity with these things? Because, you know, like, the power shouldn't only lie in the executive. I think, you know, Parliament, unfortunately, is quite muted on these issues, but Parliament's supposed to exercise its own constitutional sovereignty and enforcement of this. So I'm not seeing any mechanism by which Parliament can actually do that, or where it's compelled to increase its understanding of these things. Because you see, I mean, the reality is that if one branch of government fails us, another one should be able to pick up the slack to hold the other one account. And because Parliament is so critically indeficient on climate in general, it's done nothing virtually on it. It's not equipped to do this. So, I mean, I did put in the comments, maybe the right thing to do would also be to be lobbying, or to build it into this particular bill and put it in the draft text, that there must be a parliamentary joint standing committee on the climate and ecological crisis, which allows for this oversight to take place, because we can't only leave it to the executive to do the right thing. We're lucky now that we've got a government that is doing this. But what happens, you know, if there's a change of power in 2024 and suddenly they don't care about this anymore? We'll be in a very, very, very tight spot then.
Yeah, absolutely. Very good point. Or what happens if the current party stays in power, but the current minister is replaced by someone who's a lot more into extraction? Then we do sit with the situation. That's why certainly one of the suggestions I think we made is that there does need to be more parliamentary oversight, more reporting to Parliament. So I think those things are very important to be strengthened. And currently, I think a lot of that responsibility will sit with this particular portfolio committee, which, with the greatest of respect, didn't necessarily understand some of the climate change considerations as much as one would have thought they would. So this is another thing that can go into the comments, is to really compel education and awareness. And that's something that can happen from primary school level all the way through to things like inductions for parliamentarians and councillors, is that really making climate awareness and climate change education necessary as well. So yeah, Traverse, no easy answers there. Again, obviously, as the stronger this law is, the better, because then it sort of outlives the changes of people. But certainly, I think getting the legislature more involved in oversight is important. And then that issue of an independent science body, if that's also codified in law, then hopefully it's got some legal weight, so to speak, and it can call out like crazy decisions that get made by the executive. So Mbali, Traverse, I hope I answered those questions. And is there any more? So you were saying the law should never be written around a particular party in power. That is true. I think it's more ensuring that the responsibilities and the powers are kind of spread out sufficiently that, as Traverse said, the different organs can sort of keep each other in check. And, you know, before we had this climate change bill, and, you know, we don't have the act yet, we were using NEMA, the National Environment Management Act, to start to work with climate change and bring that awareness to within the realms of sort of more pre-climate environmental concerns. And then there's the Constitution. So, I mean, for example, we're busy suing the Minister of Energy for wanting to build a new coal-fired power station. And a lot of the arguments there are climate change related and relate to various rights in the Bill of Rights. So fortunately, our judiciary is still strong, in my opinion. I'll keep scrolling through questions, otherwise more hands are invited. Danny says, wondering if the DMRE is responsible for setting sectoral targets for energy and minerals is like the fox guarding the hen house. Yes. So the Minister of the Environment obviously would do that in consultation with the Minister of Energy and Mineral Resources in this case. What that means, I don't know. Again, I suppose the political power comes in here. Can someone like Minister Mantashe override someone like Minister Creasy? So a lot of these things need to tie together really well to make sure that the kind of right restrictions on emissions are in place. So the NDC, even though this one is not as strong as it should be, I guess it makes the most sense that that is this kind of initial guiding document. And then that the sectoral emissions targets and the carbon budgets all will fit in with what the NDC, because the NDC obviously in effect creates a total carbon budget in terms of how much carbon can South Africa emit. And then the trick is to ensure that the different pieces all tie into that so that that's not exceeded. Unfortunately, there's a clause in this bill which is also very disturbing. It says that the total, adding up all the sectoral emissions targets together, will not necessarily add up to the total national carbon budget, which is something we're certainly going to be taking issue with. Because what are they saying there? If, you know, what do they mean if they say something like that? Because really, at the end of the day, it does come down to actual emissions that need to be reduced in terms of certain targets and scientific imperatives. Okay, let's traverse this comment on a joint standing committee, which is quite a good idea. Okay, so another comment, corporations should not be permitted to insulate the key decision makers. Company directors must be held criminally liable for non-compliance and face very stiff financial penalties for transgression. So the Fiji Climate Act, for example, is quite strong on this, and it cross-references with their Companies Act and says that directors who do not adequately consider climate risk are basically being negligent or, you know, not discharging their responsibilities properly. So we will put something like that in our comments, just for example. Another thing that we'll be putting in there, I mean, we didn't go into these in the toolkit because they're a little bit more outlier in a sense, but seeing if we can get away with asking for the bill to compel companies to disclose climate risk. Because obviously the private sector is where the actual emissions happen. And this bill does not go particularly far in terms of directly roping the private sector in. It more sets the framework of regulation, which ultimately will result in limiting greenhouse gas emissions. But that Fiji bill, as I say, actually goes further and start stipulating what directors of companies actually need to do.
Team, if you spot any good questions as well, and just bring them to my attention or
Brendan,
mention them. Yeah.
there is a question from Courtney Morgan. Does it hold more weight if a group of organizations come together for comment, or is it quantity of comments more important?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I mean, I think certain commenters or certain places from where comments will come will have a kind of, I suppose, more weight or credibility, even if that's just a perception. So it's hard to say. I mean, from the CER's point of view, we're doing comments on behalf of the Life After Coal campaign. That's ourselves, Groundwork and Earthlife. But we also will invite people to endorse those comments. So perhaps some of these more detailed comments that might come from certain places, if they're strongly endorsed, will also have a lot of weight. But I think having a spread and a diversity is also important. So perhaps people can do their own in terms of the areas that they're comfortable with or they feel are directly impacted, but also then endorse some of the more sort of comprehensive comments that might come from bodies like ourselves. Thanks, Nani. Thanks, Courtney. Natasha?
Yes, hi, can you hear me?
Can.
Excellent. I actually just want to bounce off of Courtney's question, and I wanted to bring up basically putting together a public response for myself. I'm putting a lot of detail and effort into it. But for example, for people who are not quite as well versed for the climate change bill and all the acts around it, like for example, my mother or my sister, who I'm encouraging to put together public responses themselves. Is that worthwhile? Like, they're not going to be putting in as much detail-oriented work as I have or anyone else here. But is it still worth them putting together a paragraph or so of just basic, oh, I am in support of, or I think that this should be expanded better, with just very basic layman's terms? Is that still worth doing?
Absolutely. I mean, as I said at the outset, the portfolio committee, at the end of the day, they're answerable to their voters. Ultimately, they have certain responsibilities. And if they really get a sense that this is an issue that a lot of people care about and are concerned about, that tells a story, and that sort of starts swinging things more into our direction. And then the purpose of this toolkit, for example, is to really lay out the most kind of glaring issues with the bill. So if someone like your mom or your sister then took a look at the toolkit and said, oh, okay, well, I can relate to that issue of transparency, you know, this whole culture of secrecy, it doesn't work elsewhere and it probably won't work here. And, you know, those kind of authentic things come through, it's definitely worth it. I mean, imagine we had a situation where 20 million people submitted comments. I mean, that would send such a strong signal to the politicians that we'd probably start seeing big change.
Yeah, we can but hope.
We can but hope. So, but yeah, definitely, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Even if they're a paragraph long, that's well worth it. Thanks, Natasha.
Thanks, Brendan. There's another question from Alfred Wills. Agreed that it is vital to refer to the 2021 NDC in the Act, but the minister says she can only do this after the bill becomes an act, due to the bill being based on the aged climate change response policy. Does this argument hold water?
I can't give you a definitive answer, Alf, but I don't feel that it does. You know, the minister said that. The department also said that they couldn't use the updated NDC because only the 2015 NDC had long-term targets. I have a feeling that they are trying to find reasons. And I mean, we just need to look at the statement made by our president this week. So, I mean, I opened this whole session reading an excerpt from his letter where he's talking about the crisis we're in, but this week he was making statements about how we need space to be able to extract and burn fossil fuels in a sustainable manner, as he said. And then we know in terms of the kind of power dynamics behind something like this, I mean, there is a lot of vested interest in fossil fuels, in mining, and a lot of interest in not reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and certainly not doing it in any kind of hurry. So the reason for the 2015 NDC, I mean, maybe there's a technical legal reason that I'm not aware of why it had to be that. I don't think so, and I think we should make a big noise about it. And let the minister then come more on record with a more sort of motivated reason why. But yeah, I mean, again, you know, we kind of rely on the goodwill of the minister that says when the thing comes into being, when the act comes into being, then she will do that. And knowing this minister, and if she had her way, she probably would. But it could be a different minister, or this minister could be subject to pressures that we're not aware of, that tie her hands. That's Alf. I see we're actually coming to the end of our time. Alf is also saying that should we not be pushing for text in the bill to reflect the Paris Agreement obligations to conduct the highest level of ambition possible? Yes, absolutely. You know, the Paris Agreement, for those that don't know, say we should stay well within 2 degrees of warming, but we should really try to aim for 1.5. The science is coming out more strongly all the time that we really should be staying at 1.5. So certainly we want to be putting that into our comments, and we should be pushing for that. And then I think we need to end, but I want to end on Mbali's point over here, and this is an important one and certainly will form a big part of our comments. So the bill is a framework piece of legislation, and the intention with something like that is there are going to be a lot of regulations to give meat to the bones. And again, so the department has indicated that they are very busy with a work plan of what regulations are going to be made and when they're going to be made. And so certainly we in our comments are also going to be asking for more information around that regulation making process. Because again, if we've got the right people in charge of making the regulations and they've got the right intentions, great. Then hopefully we'll see some good regulations soon. But again, if there's a change of guard or different sort of pressures, we might never see some of those regulations. So we certainly want as many details about those as possible. Yeah. Okay, Diane, you've also got a question there on local government and funding. So this bill obviously doesn't deal with funding at all. Technically, perhaps it should. I mean, again, the Fiji bill goes into great detail and also talks about sort of carbon trading, which is another whole viper's nest. Yeah, I think, look, everyone here is welcome to engage with us directly. I don't want to keep the call going too long after it's supposed to have ended, and I see there are certainly questions and comments that continue to come through. So I think, yeah, rather than keep people on, as I say, you're welcome to engage with us. And the team is going to be sending a copy or a document with the toolkit, which is basically all that we spoke about today, which you can then also use. And the page on our website that has all this kind of bill related stuff is going to continually be updated and having new information put on there. So by all means, we'll be happy to engage and share the sort of our progress in bigger chunks as we go along. And then we will certainly be putting out an invite for people to endorse the comments in some form or another. So if you would be happy to do that, that gives a lot of weight as well, but do your own. I think it's a good idea. Thank you very much. Handing over back to Noni to do a vote of thanks and to close.
Thank you so much, Brendan. and Tatenda for your presentations, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. As Brendan mentioned, we do have a section on our website dedicated to the climate change bill under the pollution and climate change program, where you can just search for the climate change bill. All information from today's session will be on the recording, as well as a fact sheet and some advocacy material that are linked on there. Should you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us on our website. The details are there. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great evening.
Thanks all. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much, everyone. Go well.